The gavel came down like a thunderclap, a hard, final sound that seemed to rearrange the air in the room. Cameras pivoted, lenses reflecting 1,000 tiny flashes. The bailiff's jaw tightened. His eyes pinched into slits as if trying to stop the moment from spilling over. Reporters rose in a collective intake of breath. Someone whispered the headline before it even hit the feeds. Judge Thomas slaps Jasmine Crockett with $500 million fine. A gasp rippled through the gallery. Sharp. Involuntary. The kind that reveals we're witnessing something we weren't meant to see. Phones lifted. Footage already uploading. The courthouse doors trembled, with the press of bodies trying to record the fallout. In the center of it all, Judge Thomas sat like a man who'd swallowed his own verdict and found it sweet. His posture was precise, almost ceremonial. A small, ruthless smile curved at the corner of his mouth. He looked like the architect of a lesson, delighted at its execution. Across the bench, Jasmine Crockett remained unmoving. She breathed once, long and controlled, the kind of breath earned from years of standing in the fire without flinching. Her face was calm, not empty. There was a kind of quiet people mistake for weakness until it ends up being the thing that breaks the spectacle. Her hands lay folded, steady as a promise. Around her, aides scrabbled, whispering legalese and damage control, but she did not look to them. She met the room the way a captain meets a storm, knowing where she must steer. Flashbulb snapped. A microphone caught Judge Thomas's final cutting line. It dropped into the room like a verdict within a verdict. You will pay for the chaos. You sowed $500 million to teach you and anyone like you that there are consequences. His voice was cold, cruelty, dressed as civility. The number hung there, absurd and precise, turning outrage into a physical thing. A weight, a headline, a calculation of intent. For a beat, the world felt off balance, as if someone had tilted. The map and a familiar country had slid into shadow. And then, under the weight of that blow, Jasmine Crockett rose, not to plead, not to protest, but to speak. But what she did next would break the room. They say court is where facts live, but sometimes it's where power puts on its coat and walks out as truth. The complaint that birthed this judgment began as a tangle of contracts and donations. A complex suit accusing Jasmine's nonprofit of misallocated funds tied to a project that helped immigrants find legal aid, shelter, and work. On paper, it read like ledgerose and procedural errors. For the people whose lives were changed by that project, it read like survival. A mother who finally had paperwork to enroll her child in school. A man whose record was expunged and who now paid taxes for the first time in years. A grandmother who could stop choosing between medicine and rent. $500 million is not a number most of us carry in our heads. It's a hammer. For Jasmine's team, it meant immediate consequences. Lawyers who'd been mounting a strategic appeal now faced budget lines that didn't add up. A fundraising calendar shoved into crisis mode. The community center that rented space from Jasmine's nonprofit had planned a summer after-school program. Their director was on the phone, voice tight, explaining they might have to cancel if the legal fund dried up. Volunteers who had driven seniors to court or tutored kids were suddenly wondering if the safety net they'd built would snap. This wasn't just about money, it was about voice. The courtroom had become a theater where precedent and punishment mingled, and a catastrophic fine like this sends a message. Speak loudly, push back, and the system will make the cost unbearable. For activists across the city, it felt like watching a warning sign go up above their own efforts. Fundraisers paused as donors calculated risk. Legal advocates, who often work on shoestrings and hope, now had to decide whether to divert resources. 2-1, high-pro for a battle at the expense of dozens of ordinary cases. Politically, the timing was poisonous. Jasmine had been a thorn in certain corridors of power, not for show, but because she kept showing up for people others left out. Her speeches had framed policy in human terms. Her bills had tied budgets to bodies. In a season where lines between law and politics blurred, the penalty fast became less a legal judgment and more an act of political theater. Opponents framed it as accountability. Allies saw it as a weaponized silence. Across neighborhoods, small vignettes began to stitch themselves into a larger pattern. A counselor at a shelter quietly erased a list of names, waiting for help. A teacher who'd partnered with Jasmine's program looked at empty chairs she'd already promised to fill. A young organizer posted a shaky video if they can. Do this to Jasmine. We're next. And had found 1,000 sympathetic shares within an hour. Rage spread in private messages and in public posts. How many millions would it take to shut down a movement? How many headlines before a voice is muted for good? And there was something else. Precedent. Money, when weaponized, becomes a long tale of fear. It tells other would-be challengers that speaking up can bankrupt you. It tells donors that association comes with risk. It tells communities that their advocates can be extinguished with an accountant's signature. For a progressive, immigrant-friendly, Identity Pride audience, the fine read as more than punitive. It read like an attempt to rewrite the map of who is allowed to resist and who must bow. So the room that heard the gavel was hearing more than a legal sentence. It heard an attempt to make courage costly. It heard a future where voices get bought quiet. That is what this $500 million number meant, not just a figure, but a threat. But to see why the judge acted like this, meet the man behind the gavel. Judge Thomas didn't arrive at his bench by accident. He climbed, step by meticulous step, with a script memorized and a camera, always within reach. In his early years on the circuit, he was praised for decisiveness, a label that, over time, curdled into something sharper. Theatricality, dressed as principle. Where other judges wrote careful opinions, Thomas wrote lines that read like verdicts for the evening news. He preferred gestures that fit a headline, a pointed pause, a clipped reprimand, a stare that could puncture a witness. To his supporters, he was a firm hand restoring order. To those who watched more closely, he was a man who had learned the power of spectacle. There were small moments that, in retrospect, read like props in the construction of a persona. At a high-profile sentencing years ago, he paused mid-speech to glance directly at the gallery and intone, "Let this be the last time our courts entertain chaos." A local newscaster replayed that line for days. Thomas was interviewed on Sunday, shows where he talked about taking back the courtroom. He cultivated a public image of stern, no-nonsense, fairness. But inside the legal community, there was a whisper. His penalties often landed disproportionately on those who fought loudest, against entrenched power. His docket grew dense with cases that carried political heat. Dissidents, organizers, and outspoken advocates found themselves facing fines and restrictions that, when stacked together, looked less like impartial enforcement and more like strategic silencing. Defense attorneys began to notice patterns: harsher financial penalties for certain kinds of nonprofits, longer injunctions when defendants dared to make moral arguments in public, sharp rebukes for attorneys who spoke with moral urgency rather than procedural caution. In the halls outside his courtroom, colleagues would trade incredulous glances after rulings that seemed calibrated more for spectacle than jurisprudence. Thomas's courtroom was also a theater for his personal mythology. He loved cameras. He scheduled high-profile hearings at times guaranteed to draw press. He made public statements about protecting civic order that read well on cable and well in conservative op-eds. When critics accused him of politicking from the bench, he would smile a thin, practiced smile and speak of impartiality and judicial duty. The contradiction fit him like a tailored suit. Moral rhetoric hung over tactical moves, and the rhetoric did the heavy lifting in the court of public opinion. A former clerk later leaked an anecdote that didn't make the headlines but explained the pattern to those who would listen. During a private dinner with influential donors, after a particularly prominent trial, Thomas reportedly spoke, not of law, but of legacy. He asked, according to the clerk, "How do you want to be remembered? As the judge who let chaos run, or the judge who put a line in the sand?" The question, asked in private, revealed the calculation beneath the robe. Legacy, not law, had begun to steer decisions. Legacy required spectacle. Spectacle required victims who could be made demonstrations. There were moments where his bravado cracked behind closed doors. Staff described a man who needed applause, who lingered on compliments like a performer basking in the lights. He sought headlines the way other men sought approval. When a ruling didn't generate the outrage he expected, he would press on with subsequent, harsher orders, as if trying to engineer the public reaction he felt entitled to. It was an almost desperate choreography. Create a problem, strike decisively, bask in the aftermath. Power, in his hands, became a performance. And yet, for all the machinery of Pisano, his decisions left tangible wreckage. Nonprofits went silent. Community advocates paused their outreach. A city organizer once told a small group, "When Thomas wags his finger, donors listen. They don't want to be on the wrong side of his headlines." In that way, his rulings functioned as a policy of deterrence. Make the cost of resistance visible, and resistance will thin. But hubris carries its own bill. The more Thomas sought to shape history, the more his judgments began to show the fingerprints of fear, fear of being forgotten, fear of losing control, fear of a narrative that didn't include him as the hero. The difference between a judge and a celebrity is supposed to be restraint, the quiet confidence of someone who doesn't need an audience. And Thomas's hunger for spectacle betrayed an insecurity that would become a fault line. Publicly, he preached order. Privately, he engineered consent. He framed dissent as disorder and equated loudness with chaos. Yet those he punished were often the very people who refused to let suffering stay nameless. Behind the robe's stern lines beat a man who believed a headline could define a legacy, and he would, if he had to, craft the headline himself. Across town, Jasmine's story was nothing like that. She learned to speak for people who had been taught to stay small. Jasmine Crockett's earliest memories are not of podiums or cameras, but of the narrow hallway of a small apartment where her mother kept a stack of envelopes, each one a promise made and paid for. The envelopes were bills and notices, and, sometimes, letters of thanks from neighbors. She'd helped the neighbor who needed a signature to get their pension sorted, the single father who needed someone to argue for him when the landlord refused repairs. Her mother taught her two things that never left: keep the lights on for the people who forget to ask for help, and when someone's voice doesn't reach the table, pull up a chair for them. School introduced her to another lesson: how systems can look fair on paper and still be cruel in practice. In high school civics, she watched a debate where students argued statutes and citations. But outside, a family struggled because bureaucracy had become a barrier. Jasmine volunteered at a legal clinic, the kind of place that smells faintly of coffee and hope. She learned how to fill out forms, how to locate a missing signature, how to write a sentence that could change a life. One winter, she stayed late helping a woman with a deportation notice. The woman cried once, quietly, when the paperwork finally came together. Jasmine still remembers the sound like a string being tuned. It told her exactly what justice should feel like: practical, proximate, human. The moment that most often gets told around campfires and precinct meetings happened when she was 20. A community center down the block, a place where kids came after school for hot meals and math help, faced closure when a funder pulled out. The city paperwork was tangled and no one could see a path forward. Jasmine organized a meeting, not as a spectacle but as a series of conversations. She knocked on doors, listened. She connected an earnest teacher with a retired accountant who then found a loophole that saved the fund. The center stayed open. Years later, the same kids who'd learned to read in that room would volunteer in the clinic she helped build. That small rescue became a pattern in her life. Fix the leak now. Don't wait for someone to write a memo about it. She pursued law because she wanted the levers not to wield them as a curtain, but to open doors. As an attorney, she defended people who had been minimized by systems designed to be efficient, at the expense of humanity. She learned courtroom strategy, sure, but she learned something else. Language matters. A statute can be dressed in cold words, and a single well-framed sentence can tilt the judge's attention toward the person behind the case. Her clients were not numbers on a docket. They were mothers, fathers, laborers, and young people whose futures waited on whether someone could explain their story in a way that a stranger in a robe would care about. When Jasmine moved into public office, she did it the way she'd always worked: quietly, relentlessly, with an eye for solving what others called small problems. She fought for funding for translators at the hospital, for after-school programs in neighborhoods investors had written off, for legal protections that kept families from being torn apart on technicalities. Her speeches were never about optics. They were about outcomes. She preferred community halls to ribbon cuttings, hearing every complaint because the detail often contained the solution. Her colleagues sometimes misread her calm for passivity. In committee rooms, she would sit and listen until the other side exhausted its talking points. Then she'd stand and, without theatrics, deliver a question or a story that exposed assumptions. People left those rooms feeling the sharpness of being understood, and then, often, the awkwardness of being wrong. She cultivated a style that was durable: prepare better than everyone, work harder than everyone, and let the work speak for you. There were costs to that humility. The media loved a performative scold, and Jasmine did not often oblige. She turned down interviews that felt like traps. She didn't court viral moments. She courted steady change. Yet those who benefited from her work knew her as someone who showed up when it was inconvenient and who kept her promises when the cameras left. Voters trusted her the way neighbors trust someone who waters your plants when you travel. Small, sacred faith. And she had losses that kept her steady. Years ago, Jasmine lost a close friend to a preventable hospital error, paperwork missed in a transition between shifts. The grief reshaped her not into rage that sought headlines, but into a resolute insistence that systems be made to serve people reliably. She pushed for oversight committees and patient advocates, not for applause, but for accountability. When the bills passed, she did not call the photographer. She sent a note to the family and kept working. That integrity stitched itself into the culture around her. Community leaders called with problems and didn't ask for political favors. They asked for help because they knew she would move. Young organizers came for mentorship and found not a celebrity but a steady presence, a legal mind, a tactical ear, a voice that insisted the human story not be lost in policy talk. Her nonprofit work was an extension of that, a project built from small acts, a safety net for the people she'd promised to hold. Even under pressure, she remained measured. Where others might have raged, she took inventory. What's at stake? Who will be harmed? What's the plan? It wasn't stoicism. For show, it was a strategy born of scarcity when you are accountable to vulnerable people. Theatrics waste resources, they need that restraint. Made her a powerful adversary because it meant she could outlast spectacle, while flash seeks applause. Steady work builds infrastructure, so when the summons arrived, a suit that would grow into a headline too big for the room. Few expected what would transpire next. The courtroom breathed like a living thing, a low, constant hum of anticipation. Under the fan of fluorescent light, reporters clustered at the back, their notebooks open like small altars. The gallery was a quilt of faces, constituents in hoodie jackets, older activists in church hats, young lawyers with their pens poised. Jasmine Crockett sat at the defense table with 2 legal pads and a quiet readiness, as if every silence had already been catalogued. Opposite her, prosecutors shifted papers with the restless precision of people waiting to watch a plan complete itself. Judge Thomas entered like a conductor taking his podium, the room folding into attention the way a chorus tightens when the baton taps. He opened the hearing with a voice that wore civility like armor, a tone calibrated to carry. Efficient, stern, theatrical. This court, he intoned, will not tolerate chaos dressed as charity. A ripple moved through the room. Phones, stilled, he had chosen words that would translate well to sound bites. The first exchanges were precision sparring. Jasmine's lead counsel spoke in a measured cadence, walking through transaction histories and compliance procedures, pointing out audit trails and remedial steps already taken. The language was technical, but Jasmine's presence made the abstract human. When an accountant's note was referenced, she looked toward the gallery where volunteers sat and smiled briefly. A small signal. These were people, not credit lines. Thomas answered each legal point with a question that seemed to do more than adjudicate. It provoked. He leaned forward on occasion, a smirk at the corner of his mouth that read less like curiosity and more like bait. He asked whether the nonprofit had deliberately obscured funds, a phrase meant to age into headlines. Prosecutors, sensing momentum, swapped glances and nudged toward punitive framing. The tone shifted from adjudication to accusation. Microbehaviors began to ripple outward. A juror, though, this was a bench hearing. The room still housed onlookers whose body language mattered, crossed and uncrossed his legs, a small sign of unease. Reporters murmured into sleeves. The camera operators adjusted angles as if cueing a scene. Jasmine's legal team maintained composure, but a young associate's jaw tightened when Thomas characterized a procedural oversight as moral failing. The court clock seemed to tick faster with every pivot from law to spectacle. Thomas punctured the procedural with rhetorical theatrics. He read from a prepared list of victim impact that included not only financial loss but supposed eroded trust. He adduced a litany of worst-case scenarios. Charities shuttered, services halted, donors fleeing, and spoke of deterrence in tones that suggested performance. He leaned in and, in a voice that tasted of show, asked Jasmine directly, "Do you understand the ripple of your choices?" The question was less about her comprehension and more about framing her as the author of communal harm. Jasmine answered without flourish. She spoke of audits, of corrective measures, of the people already aided by the programs in question. Her words were specific and anchored. Names, dates, outcomes. When Thomas suggested, with a thin smile, that accountability required spectacle, she replied, "Accountability requires correction and restoration for the harmed, Your Honor, not grandstanding." The remark landed like a pebble in a pond, sending concentric ripples through the room. But the judge would not let the ripples settle. He escalated. What began as questions about remediation became hypotheticals about punishment. He invoked language of deterrence in increasingly theatrical turns, painting Jasmine not as a public servant who'd made procedural errors, but as a provocateur who'd challenged order. He spoke of lessons to be taught and boundaries to be enforced, the cadence of his sentences making each phrase hunger for headlines. As the hearing wore on, the prosecutor's tone shifted from dispassionate to performative. They painted, in broad strokes, a narrative where charitable work was a veneer and misallocation, a deliberate design. Each assertion drummed a beat of possible calamity. Jasmine's team countered with documents and testimony that described intent, oversight, and corrective action. The contrast was stark hard numbers against the story made to sizzle. At one point, Thomas produced a list of alleged irregularities and read them aloud with a relish that bordered on relish. The gallery flinched. Activists glanced at one another as if the floor had tilted. He spoke of fines as instruments of moral calculus, words that translated into one brutal arithmetic. Silence equals compliance, and compliance is cheap when bought with fear. Jasmine kept her composure. She answered each pointed insinuation with facts, with the faces of those she'd helped. There were moments when her restraint felt like a rebuke that needed no words. She did not raise her voice. She chose details that made the human consequences of punitive spectacle impossible to reduce to talking points. Still, the escalation continued. The judge prodded. The prosecutor intensified. The room's air became charged, a storm forming on a clear day, and the sense of inevitability, a crescendo of punitive theater, closed in. Everyone in the gallery felt it. A choreography moving toward a climax that would not be technical but theatrical. A legal judgment shaped a spectacle. And then, without warning, he dropped the bomb. The judgment began as a legal recital and ended as an act of theatrical violence. Judge Thomas cleared his throat and recited his findings with the measured cadence of someone delivering not merely law but a lesson. Each phrase was deliberate, each pause designed to widen the silence that followed. He cataloged alleged transgressions, misallocation, reckless stewardship, breach of public trust, and folded them into a single moral indictment. Then he spoke the number, slow and precise, letting it land like a physical object, in light of the harm caused and the need for deterrence. This court imposes a civil penalty of $500 million. For a beat, the courtroom lost its sound. Even the hum of cameras seemed to step back, as if the microphone itself were startled. A gasp escaped from the gallery, long, involuntary, followed by a rustle of papers and the sudden, mechanical clatter of a recorder being switched on. Reporters leaned forward. A cameraman's lens shook. The bailiff sucked air through his teeth. Somewhere, a volunteer's fingers went white on a program. Judge Thomas's tone betrayed no tremor of doubt. It was clinical and triumphant at once. The voice of someone convinced he had not only judged a case, but made a public example. His eyes swept the room, settling on the gallery, as if to ensure the number registered not just as punishment but as spectacle. He spoke of deterrence again, of setting a precedent, of restoring trust to a system he framed as injured. Each clause pushed the fine from arithmetic into theater, a headline he'd engineered into law. Jasmine felt the blow like a physical thing. For a moment, she blinked. A quick, human fissure in an otherwise composed face, the tiny contraction that reveals impact before policy reasserts. Then she breathes, slow and intentional, the breath of someone trained to measure consequence before reaction. Her hands, folded a moment earlier, flexed once, then smoothed into stillness. She did not erupt. She did not slump. She held herself, like a steadying hand on a shaking table. Her legal team exchanged quick, tight glances. An aide began tapping a phone, fingers jerky with new urgency. The public reaction was immediate and volcanic. Phones lit up across city blocks. The headline propagated like a match across kindling. Teams of journalists began shouting questions, their voices a serrated chorus. Ms. Crockett, will you appeal? Judge Thomas, can you explain the calculation? In the press cluster, microphones jostled for space. Camera operators rose, trying to capture the postures of both parties, to trap the story in a single frame that could be replayed and looped. Social feeds filled with stunned short videos. Outside the courthouse, a young activist held up a sign, and then lowered it as if the fine had made even protests feel brittle. Inside the courtroom, there was a strain of private chaos sewn through the public drama. Jasmine's aides moved like a well-drilled reef of response. Calls made, lawyers whispered instructions, staffers pulling up financial models to see if the number could even be entertained in realistic terms. A legal partner crouched to speak, quickly, but the judge's gavel tapped. A sharp punctuation that demanded decorum even as the room reeled. A pause unfolded, not the ordinary brief hush that follows a ruling, but a charged, cinematic silence. It was the kind of quiet that feels like history inhaling. People in the gallery stared at one another, eyes wide, as though confirming that they had all been witness to the same improbable arithmetic. In that silence, the weight of consequences pressed outward, the nonprofit's account balancing on a precipice. Summer programs in doubt. Donors thinking overnight about reputational calculus. Volunteers who'd trusted a steady hand, wondering whether their safety net had been burned. In the hallways after the announcement. Conversations fractured into exclamations and contingency plans. A director of a local shelter, overheard on a call, whispered a single word repeated into the line. $500 million. It sounded less like a number and more like an instruction manual for loss. Community organizers convened in coffee shops and church basements, some in tears, others furious, plotting legal rallies and emergency fundraising. Board members who had been cautiously optimistic now muttered about insolvency. The city's political class slid into defensive postures. Opponents crowed about accountability. While allies scrambled for a message that could steady a rattled base, journalists parsed the judge's language for motive. Analysts sketched out the arithmetic of appeals and injunctions, trying to map how anyone could possibly satisfy such a penalty without imploding. Legal scholars were quoted saying the figure was unprecedented and likely reversible. But in the immediate span between headline and appellate motion, many people reacted as though the sentence were a fait accompli, a public shaming writ in dollars. Amid the external uproar, there was a quieter, more intimate fallout. Volunteers who'd come to court with hope left with a hollow where certainty used to be. A counselor who had relied on Jasmine's programs texted a single stark message to her staff: "We need a plan B." Donors who had once written checks in trust placed their phones face down on tables, eyes darting toward financial statements. The city's smallest safety nets, the ones sewn together by unglamorous day-to-day labor, suddenly looked threadbare. Through it all, Jasmine's composure did not break. She listened to the questions, allowed her team to murmur, and when given the floor, she rose without haste. The room had been reading her as though she might appear diminished, ready to recede into legal maneuvering and PR damage control. Instead, the way she stood carried an unmistakable signal. This was not a retreat. There was another pause, different from the stunned silence that had followed the sentence. It was a moment threaded with attention and anticipation. The collective held breath of a room waiting to see how a leader would respond to an act meant to silence her. Cameras pivoted. Reporters leaned in. The public, suddenly invested in the shape of the next second, hovered between outrage and hope. Most people expected her to retreat. Instead, she stepped forward. Asterisk. The room had been hollowed by the sentence. Now it gathered itself into a single, expectant breath. Jasmine sat for a long, deliberate count, enough to let the number sink, enough to let the room feel the physics of a human choice. She rose. Without flourish, there were no aides at her side to hand her talking points, no stage director cueing a line. She walked to the center with the same unshowy steadiness she brought to community rooms and emergency clinics. The clack of a camera shutter sounded like a heartbeat. Someone, somewhere, whispered, "Speak." She began quietly, as if beginning at the bedside of someone wounded. "Your Honor, members of the court, the people in this room, and those listening, you've just spoken a sentence not against me, but against people who had nowhere else to go." Her voice was clear, controlled, the voice of someone who had practiced listening enough to know when to speak. The courthouse hush tightened. Every microphone angled toward her like a curious ear. She did not recite legalese. She told a story. 5 years ago, she said, a mother named Rosa came into our clinic. She had 3 kids, 1 job, and a deportation notice that made nights into battlegrounds. We filled the right forms, found the right lawyer, kept the kids in school while the process moved. Today, Rosa's daughter is in college. She volunteers. She votes. Her family is whole because someone answered a call that should have been answered by systems, not by miracles. Jasmine looked past the cameras to the gallery, where volunteers and program alumni sat, like proof. This is the consequence of work you have labeled charitable, but don't mistake its scale. It is survival. Her voice shifted from bedside to ledger, and she walked the court through straight facts with the same modest force she used in policy rooms. Audits had been conducted, remedial steps taken, independent accountants engaged. No criminal intent had been shown. Infractions demonstrated were procedural and promptly corrected. She cited precedent cases where penalties were proportionate, where injunctive relief or restitution were used rather than ruinous fines. She did it simply, not to bog the room in citation, but to puncture the theater with the hard shape of law. Then she turned to address the council of spectacle. A fine this size, she said, is not about remedy. It is not about trust. It reads differently in the lives of our neighbors. It is a weapon. Her tone sharpened, but she did not raise her voice. The room felt the change like the coiling of a spring. You have framed this as a lesson, she continued, but the lesson you teach is that service can be punished, that helping those without power can be criminalized by dollars. She named the mechanisms of harm with precision. Summer programs canceled, legal clinics shuttered, the elderly left without rides to court, translators unpaid. She gave a small inventory of immediacies, names and numbers. The very things the judge's theater had tried to abstract away. Each detail was a pinprick against the performance of punishment. Bench did something that shifted the moral axis of the room. She reframed the question from legality to ethics. What predicament does a fine like this create? She asked. It forces boards to choose between legal defense and service delivery. It tells donors their money could be used as a cudgel. It makes the calculus of compassion into one of risk. And in that calculus, the vulnerable lose by design. The words landed like a verdict in themselves. She moved from examples to accountability. If our systems are fragile, she said, repair them. If oversight is needed, provide it. If restitution is required, mandate it. But do not weaponize penalty to extinguish a voice that speaks for the voiceless. Her eyes found Judge Thomas, but she did not gawk. She addressed the larger court, to watching public. This is not justice. This is spectacle masquerading as remedy. The judge, who had sat throughout with an expression of controlled triumph, began to show much changes. A smile that had been thin and prepackaged tightened as if squeezed. His fingers, steady all morning, began to tap the arm of the bench, a small fissure of impatience. Attorneys shifted in their seats. Two whispered to each other, mouths moving like the wind through leaves. Cameras zoomed. The room leaned. Jasmine's voice climbed, not into anger, but into pressure, an irresistible build. She invoked law, again, briefly, pointing to the disproportion between alleged harm and the dollar figure, then pivoted to moral plainness. I stand here not to litigate spectacle, but to protect people, she said. If we let this stand, then anytime someone dares to organize on behalf of the poor, their good work can be priced out of existence. The hush broke. It did not shatter into chaos, but widened into a field of collective recognition. Faces in the gallery were not just shocked anymore, they were aligned. A volunteer dabbed at the corner of an eye. A young organizer's shin rose with newfound resolve. Newsroom editors scribbled notes for a line that would run in headlines for days. Then came the line that would echo in social clips and placards. Jasmine steadied, and with the composure of a person who knew she spoke for more than herself, said, "You can price us out. You can try to scare us into silence. But you cannot buy our courage, and you cannot fine away the truth." Even as the words left her mouth, the atmosphere in the courtroom altered. The judge's practiced veneer thinned. For the first time that morning, an involuntary motion crossed his face, a tiny intake of breath, the eyelids fluttering as if to blink away something he didn't expect. His jaw worked once. A hand that had held the gavel with casual assurance trembled and hovered. Some witnesses later described seeing a wetness at the edge of his eyes. Others said it was sweat. The distinction felt like a moral measurement in the moment. The prosecutor opened his mouth to interject, but a look swept through the room, from defense table to gallery to press rows, that magnetized attention back to Jasmine. Her final cadence was quiet and merciless in its simple truth. Justice is not a set of headlines. It is a set of obligations. We will meet ours. We ask only that you meet yours, without theatrics and without destroying the very people you claim to defend. The silence that followed was different from the stunned quiet after the dollar figure. It was a moral hush, the kind that comes when a truth has been revealed, and the social body recognizes the exposure. The judge's smile had been pinned into something far less certain. His eyes darted as if for precedent that could blind him, for a script that might restore authority. Micro-reactions cascaded through the room. A clerk's shoulders dropped. A reporter adjusted her notes to catch the repeatable line. A volunteer squeezed another's hand. Cameras angled for close-ups, on faces registering a rare reversal, arrogance deflated by dignity. In the minutes that followed, colleagues streamed toward Jasmine's table, not with cautious congratulations, but with urgent embraces. And the gallery's energy reorganized into a palpable resolve. Within minutes, the clip was everywhere. The clip landed like a thunderclap. Within minutes of Jasmine's words looping across feeds, that loop became an argument, then a movement. The courtroom footage, raw and untrimmed, was edited into short, shareable bursts. The line about pricing out courage, the Rosa anecdote, the judge's tremor. Those moments were the seeds of virality, compact, repeatable, impossible to ignore. Trending lists lit up. Hashtags birthed themselves and climbed. Hashtag justice, not fines. Hashtag stand with Jasmine. Hashtag defend the clinic. Influencers with millions of followers amplified the footage alongside personal testimony. A teacher in a food desert explained how the canceled after-school program would remove the only safe hours for kids. A former clinic volunteer posted photos of paperwork-strewn nights they'd spent helping clients. Late-night hosts cued the takedown for monologues, turning the judge's spectacle versus service framing into comedic yet stinging critique. Memes proliferated, some tender, some savage, but most carried the same message. Dignity over drama. Mainstream outlets moved fast. Cable panels replayed the clip in slow motion, consultants annotating micro-expressions like film critics. Opinion pages produced dueling narratives. One side praised Jasmine's moral clarity and legal grounding. Another warned voters about politicizing the judiciary. Long-form think pieces appeared within a day, interrogating Judge Thomas's career of high-profile rulings and asking whether his brand of performative justice had finally overreached. Pundits searched archives for prior hearings. constructing a through line from show trials to the $500 million sentence and to the judge's vulnerability snapped. Opened by Jasmine's steadiness. Politicians reacted along predictable but revealing lines. Some in Thomas's orbit offered cautious statements that emphasized deference to judicial independence while subtly defending the need for stern penalties. His spokespeople issued carefully worded releases. The judge acted within his discretion. Deterrence is a legitimate goal. Within hours, the judge's camp began deploying a PR apparatus. Op-eds about restoring trust, interviews where he repeated the rhetoric of deterrence, and legal scholars recruited to defend both the figure and the principle. The effort read like damage control designed to reframe spectacle as solemn duty. Opposing forces mobilized equally quickly. Jasmine's inbox filled with endorsements, community leaders, civil rights groups, and a string of local and national officials who framed the episode as a test of democratic priorities. Fundraising pages surged. Small donations poured in by the thousands, many accompanied by notes. For the kids program, for Rosa's clinic, for justice that looks like care. Volunteer signups doubled and then tripled. New organizers offered to canvass, to mobilize town halls, to raise emergency funds for at-risk services. A coalition of nonprofits issued a joint statement demanding an immediate stay on enforcement pending appeal, citing irreparable harm if funds were seized. The media environment, however, was not monolithic praise. Cynics and critics pushed back hard. Some commentators claimed the clip was cleverly edited, a manipulative soundbite designed to inflame emotions rather than instruct. Conservative hosts labeled Jasmine's ascent as wholly political theater, an opportunistic exploitation of a judge's mistake. A few legal analysts warned against conflating moral rhetoric with legal victory, noting that appellate courts often reverse extreme remedies and advising calm/on social platforms. People argued late into the night. Was this a principled stand or a savvy media moment? Could a $500 million in penalty ever be justified regardless of theatrics? That friction mattered. It prevented the story from becoming a single-sided fable and kept the political temperature high. Opponents used angry punditry to rally their base, fundraising off perceived judicial overreach and painting Jasmine as a polarizing figure. Some donors who disliked Thomas seized the moment to back Jasmine. Others, unsettled by controversy, stayed away. The debates forced allies to sharpen messages and planners to think strategically rather than simply celebratory. Back in the legal trenches, immediate practical maneuvers unfolded. Jasmine's legal team filed for an emergency stay and an expedited appeal. Lawyers drafted injunction paperwork while communications staff coordinated messaging that emphasized facts and human stakes. The judge's side signaled readiness to defend the sentence, promising vigorous litigation. The likely trajectory, prolonged appeals, parallel PR wars, and courtroom skirmishes now loomed large. It became clear that the fight would not be won in a single clip but across court dockets, editorial pages, and public opinion. The political arithmetic shifted. Grassroots energy translated into a mobilization that could not be ignored. Town halls filled, local radio shows ran call-in segments, and activists organized vigils outside the courthouse. Endorsements from unexpected quarters arrived. A centrist city council member, long cautious about public spectacle, issued a statement calling for restraint in judicial punishment and praising Jasmine's steadiness. Those cross-aisle nods hinted at broader implications. This was no longer merely about one fine, but about norms of governance and who gets to decide acceptable forms of civic service. Yet momentum imposed choices. Fundraising spikes required governance. Who would control emergency funds? How transparent would disbursements be? And how would resources be protected from future legal exposure? Volunteer surges demanded infrastructure, training, coordination, and safeguarding of ongoing services. Political endorsements raised questions about independence and strategy. Allies pushed for bold, visible actions. Seasoned organizers urged caution, reminding each other that missteps now could be weaponized by opponents. For the judge, the fallout was a different calculus. His earlier supporters tweeted defenses, but some began to distance themselves in interviews, wary of being aligned with spectacle over substance. Behind the scenes, donor conversations at once celebrated as headline-grabbing rulings now turned to concern about reputational risk. The viral reversal had not only elevated Jasmine but exposed a vulnerability in Thomas's brand. The very theatrics that had built him up now threatened to unravel his moral authority, as social media kept the conversation alive. Traditional institutions responded with slower, structural moves. Bar associations reviewed complaints, oversight bodies discussed procedural reforms, and legislators quietly drafted bills to limit certain civil penalty powers. The viral moment had generated wheels in multiple directions, legal, political, and cultural, each turning toward a reckoning. But with momentum comes choices that test character. The courtroom episode becomes, at its best, a mirror. It shows how power can be performed and how easily procedure can be turned into spectacle. But it also shows what happens when dignity meets that spectacle and refuses to be diminished. Jasmine's reply did not erase the legal machinery that produced the $500 million penalty, but it reframed the moment not as a single adjudication of funds, but as a public test of who our institutions serve and how they are held accountable. What follows, practically, is a predictable arc and an important opportunity. Legally, expect multiple threads, an emergency stay to prevent immediate enforcement, an expedited appeal that will question the proportionality and procedural basis for such a punitive civil penalty, and likely petitions for judicial review that examine whether the judge exceeded statutory discretion. These are not quick fixes. Appellate calendars, precedents, and procedural bars will define a slow, technical battlefield, yet legal motions will be accompanied by immediate administrative moves, injunction requests, bond calculations, and parallel efforts to preserve the nonprofit's operations while the courts decide. At the policy level, the shockwaves invite reform. Legislators pressured by constituent outrage, cross-partisan endorsements, and media scrutiny will introduce proposals to clarify the limits of civil penalty authority, to require proportionality studies before extreme fines, and to expand oversight mechanisms that balance deterrence with preservation of social services. Bar associations and judicial oversight bodies may open inquiries into conduct and discretion, prompting debates about the proper role of judges in high-profile civic cases. None of these changes are automatic, but the moral spotlight makes them politically viable in ways they might not otherwise be. Culturally, the episode demonstrates the power of dignity as a civic tool. Jasmine's composure did not merely score viral points. It changed the frame of public argument. Where spectacle had sought to degrade service into scandal, her response restored the human ledger, named stories, consequences, and forced the public to weigh law against lived impact. That redirection matters. Legal victories are crucial, but cultural framing shapes what institutions feel permitted to do next. When dignity becomes the dominant narrative, it constrains future theatrical excess and expands the space for accountable public service. This moment also underscores a democratic truth. Accountability requires attention. Institutions wield power in part because ordinary people cede the day-to-day vigilance that constrains it. Grassroots mobilization, fundraising, volunteer organizing, town hall pressure, translated outrage into protective action, buying time and generating political capital for structural fixes. The viral clip was the spark. Sustained civic engagement is the fuel that ensures reforms stick. That requires work, donating, volunteering, attending hearings, and pressuring legislators to translate outrage into statute. There are costs and complexities to navigate. Rapid influxes of donations must be governed transparently. Emergency funds need safeguards to prevent misuse and to shield organizations from further legal exposure. Political endorsements must be weighed against organizational independence. Allies who push for bold public theater must be balanced with strategists who protect long-term viability. These are tests, not of publicity, but of stewardship, the same values that animated Jasmine's work, emotionally and morally. The larger lesson is consequentially hopeful. This incident affirms that a single voice, grounded in integrity and facts, can pivot public perception and restrain institutional arrogance. It affirms that courage paired with discipline can do more than win headlines. It can realign incentives, catalyze reform, and rally communities to defend common goods. Victory, in this sense, is not solely whether an appellate court reverses a fine. It is whether the public learns to insist that justice look like restoration, not performance. Finally, the moment recasts responsibility as collective. Jasmine's steadiness mattered because others noticed, amplified, and acted. The moral ask is simple and demanding. Do not treat this as a one-off spectacle to be consumed and forgotten. If empathy moved a courtroom, sustaining that movement requires institutional follow-through and civic persistence. Attend the hearings, support the clinics, push for legislative limits on punitive spectacle, and insist on transparent governance where money and morals intersect. If one woman's courage moved a courtroom, imagine what a movement can do.